Well, hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us for this panel discussion about the healthcare data breach trends in 2022. So, quick history here. By the way, my name is Jake Milstein. I run events for Critical Insight, and so history here. So, a few years back, pre-pandemic, we had some questions from some of our healthcare customers where they were curious about breach trends. And when we went out and looked at statistics that were being done, there's obviously the HHS wall of shame, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And one of the problems was it doesn't really give you the context behind the data. And so now, twice a year, at the end of the year and then middle of the year, we dig into what's on that HHS dashboard, wall of shame, whatever you want to call it, and put context behind those numbers and break it down for our customers, our friends in the healthcare world, and so that's what we're here to do today. Now, we do have the breach report, which we will share a link to in the chat here in a minute. But we'll also be going through some of the major headlines from the report as we go through this. Couple of things to know. One, there's a chat on the right. If you haven't been to our events before, we keep the chat lively. If you have questions, put them in there. My favorite thing to do is to interrupt the panelists and ask questions. If you are a non-chat kind of person and you're like, ooh, I hate that bloop, 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 then there's a little bell on the top of the chat screen and you can mute it. Also, everybody who has registered will get a recording. The system will automatically send it to you. Now, it's a system, and we all know systems are imperfect. If you don't get a recording, we will also follow up with an email link. We put all of our webinars on our YouTube channel, so you can check our YouTube channel, or you can always email me, jake@criticalinsight.com, and I'll make sure you get a recording. So to test the chat out, if you want to go over there and just say where in the world you are, we'd love to know where people are joining from. I am joining from a basement in Seattle. So who are we? So Critical Insight defends critical services against cyber attacks. And that means we work with a lot of healthcare organizations. We help with HIPAA risk assessments. We help with penetration tests. We help with SOC as a service. And we do incident response. We say that we help organizations prepare for an attack, defend when an attack comes, and then respond so that the impact of the attack is lessened. Today on the panel, we have Mike Hamilton, who is one of the Critical Insight founders, along with Fred Langston. Mike is our CISO and was the former CISO of the City of Seattle. Fred Langston, long healthcare background, and is our Chief Product Officer. John Delano is joining us, and if you've been to these before, you've heard from John, valuable resource for us. He is at Christus Health now as a VP, and he was former CIO at Integris. And then there's me. I'm the event host and the least interesting person you'll hear from today. We're going to do this a little bit differently than we've done before. We're going to start today by talking about some news headlines before we go into the breach report. And the reason we're going to do that is twofold. Number one, there are some really, really, really important news headlines that have come out in the last week or two, and we want to sort of set the table with those, even if the events that happened in those news headlines were not reported on the wall of shame in the first half of the year. And the first half of the year, obviously January to the end of June. Then we'll get to the breach report headlines, and then we'll do some Q&A. So the first headline we want to talk about, and these are two headlines that are really important to the breach report this time around. And by the way, you'll notice that one of the pieces of feedback we got before is, hey, y'all, when you talk about headlines, you should include those headlines. So we will send out a copy of this deck, and we, as you can see here, have put the URLs in the deck, so you can share them with your board, your CEO, your IT folks, whoever you need to share these with, and you'll have the links to the articles. The first one accounts for a ton of the records disclosures, the breaches, the records in the first half of the year, and that is iCare Leaders EMR data breach tally surpasses 2 million. Having this EMR data breach, Fred, is a big deal.
Yeah. So, I mean, anytime, well, one of the interesting things is EMR breaches are second to finding EPHI on a network server, like on a spreadsheet or something like that. But still, numbers wise, it's second, and by far those two lead the targets in which the breaches were successful. So yeah, I believe last year there were out of about 40 or so major attacks, about 15 of those were against EMR systems. So still definitely the main target, but keep in mind that the most targeted were network file shares that had EPHI sitting on them because it's probably not protected, right? So
Yeah.
that's really where the big problem lies.
And Mike, this iCare Leaders one impacted a lot of organizations.
Yeah, and I think that if you take this in context and you look at all the numbers from all the breaches and all the records that have been disclosed, and you pull out the ones that are aberrational, right, two standard deviations from the mean, right, and you pull out this 2 million records here because that happened in one event, all of a sudden the health sector starts looking pretty good, like they're getting their security act together. This was a coup for some criminals, right? I mean, it's obvious that they're really trying to create efficiencies, reduce risk, increase revenue, by going after the one-stop shop places for records. But if you pull this one out in context, the rest of the first half of the year makes the healthcare sector start looking pretty good.
hmm hmm and John, as you look at this iCare Leaders, breach, how I mean this without the pun. How do you see it?
I like that. Certainly we're starting to see consolidation within. Oh, not starting to see consolidation in healthcare has been ongoing. But as we do, we migrate more and more records into a singular EMR, and so it's not surprising to see something of this magnitude. In my opinion, some of these specialty EMRs weren't necessarily constructed and written from a security perspective as well. So, those are things that have to improve and make sure that they have the same level of security as we would expect in today's time.
hmm
Yeah,
hmm
and you know what Oracle's doing, right? Oracle wants to be the national center for a consolidated EMR system.
hmm
What could possibly go wrong?
No idea what could possibly go wrong. And hey, my colleague Anna has posted the page to download the breach report in the chat there. Just want to call that out. Thanks, Anna. And then the second one here, Mike, and you wanted to talk about this one. Tenet Healthcare cyber attack costs. They say it's $100 million. $100
Right?
million. How do they
It
get
didn't
there?
really cost $100 million. It's in their filings, right? What they said was there was an unfavorable impact, okay, of about $100 million as a result of an attack back in April. So, this is more reflective of the long tail
hmm
of one of these events, right? If you get extorted, there's a whole bunch of things that happen after the extortion. If you lose records, a whole bunch of things happen. You got to monitor credit. You got to set up a call center. You got to do multiple mailings, right? And that lasts for a long time. Additional scrutiny by regulators, fines sometimes, and now the privacy statutes that are coming up in states, California in particular, does not have a requirement that somebody whose records were lost has to show that there was harm from that.
hmm
Just that your record was lost was enough to sue them. And so there's class actions coming from this. And, you know, additionally, the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, is really enforcing this thing called the False Claims Act, so that if you have an event and it is found that your practices did not match either your regulatory statements or your public facing statements, then they're going to fine you with this False Claims Act. So all this stuff is going on. That's why it cost $100 million.
That's a
Yeah.
great point about the False Claims Act. The FTC is all of a sudden on the warpath about going after
warpath.
people about, listen, you're claiming you have security and it turns out you do not, because a breach basically has pointed that directly out to us. The interesting component of this is, and we're going to see it on another slide, but there are third parties. The FTC has now said, matter of fact, last week announced they're making a concerted compliance effort that are peripheral to healthcare. But in fact, as you'll see on the next couple slides, one of these lost the same amount of data that eye care leaders lost, and they're not what you would think is a medical provider. But we'll wait for that slide to dig in there.
And I do want to say, I was just talking to a hospital we know, and they had a breach, and it cost them $10 million. And actually, just this morning, outside of healthcare, I was talking to a financial institution group, and the cost of breaches there has gone up 12% since 2020. So 2020 to 2022, the cost of fixing, of getting out of a breach is up 12%, which is a big number.
And Jake, I would add there too. I don't know if it's in the $100 million number or not, but whenever there's a system outage of that magnitude, there's loss of revenue from hospitals going on divert and sending patients elsewhere. Sometimes there's the need to cancel elective procedures and surgeries and those kind of things. So that does add up very quickly as well.
Yeah, I can imagine. A couple of things that are not in the first half of this year, but are very important to talk about. This top one is happening right now. Data breach at PFC, which is Professional Finance Company. They spent a lot of time figuring out their name. Impacts patients of 650 healthcare providers. Fred, this one's impacting a lot of folks.
Yeah. So this is the one I was talking about, and this is one of the ones that got the FTC's attention. Ironically, exactly 1 month ago, I was at the American Credit and Creditors International National Conference. About 2,000 people gathered in Florida to talk. I was speaking. Professional Finance Company was in the audience, and they were my topic, talking about how the fact that one of the largest healthcare breaches of the year happened in an industry that seems almost disconnected. It's medical, debt collection, right? These are debt collectors for medicine. So 650 healthcare providers, they got, 2.2 almost million records. This shows that the bad guys are realizing, I'm not going to go after healthcare. I'm going to go after all these peripheral companies that are collecting healthcare data, right? So ironically, like I said, the FTC this week, in response to PFC's breach, is saying, listen, we believe that you're not being honest about your trade practices, and we're now going to be enforcing another law called GLBA, Graham-Leach-Bliley Act, to go after them. While ironically, they're probably also going to be sued by 650 healthcare providers.
That's right.
For loss of data. So this is probably existential for Professional Finance Company.
Yep.
And they were the largest in America, and they could go bankrupt because of this.
Yeah. And think about what the 650 healthcare providers now have to do. They all individually have to claim a breach.
Yes.
And so that's going to hit every one of those, and they're going to want to recoup those losses. And so here comes the class action.
Yep.
Yeah, and I don't know if folks in the audience, have these folks in their environment, but this, I believe, just happened over July 4th. And John, you have talked. I went back to one of these previous ones, and you've talked about the dangers in accounting, the dangers in in the finance part of healthcare for breaches.
Yeah, and certainly, there's a lot that goes into that, and it's this particular one's not unprecedented. A few years ago, or it may not have been that long ago, AMCA, which is very similar, does a lot of collections for LabCorp and Quest. Actually had a breach, impacted all those records, and they did have to declare bankruptcy. So, you know, when we talked about the last headline, $100 million, again, Tenet's very large, but you know, it doesn't take long for these costs to add up, and healthcare works on very thin margins, so it doesn't take long to have a big financial impact from even a small breach.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The next one here, you know, hurts my heart. This is you know, a baby died at an Alabama hospital, and now there's a lawsuit over it. This happened more than a year ago, but the lawsuit is fairly recent. And you know, Mike, yeah, I think you know the details behind this one.
Yeah, well, it's because of the outage created by the ransomware. They were unable to know when, I think it was a heart monitor was going off,
Mm-hmm.
and the baby apparently suffered brain damage from. Yeah, no, it's a terrible story. It is a terrible story. You know, and in the news, you know, the Ponemon Institute, Larry Ponemon comes out and he does all of these surveys and aggregates them and says something. And they just published one that said, hey, you know, this ransomware stuff is really causing bad patient outcome. Well, duh. I mean, that's not surprising. That's not revelatory. That's obvious. So, I mean, I
And
don't know what to say about this.
well, so you know, interestingly, I was talking to the CEO of a hospital, and he said that you know he talks to his board about cybersecurity, and that this was the story that helped turn his board around and say, okay, we really need to focus on this because it involved a baby and now involves a lawsuit, and it's really wrecking to the staff, right? The staff does
Sure.
not want anything to happen that impacts patient care, and that this one really resonates. Speaking of patient care, the last one here is in England, but NHS cyber attack could leave staff without patient records for 3 weeks, and Fred, this one's going on right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's not the first time. If you remember back with about 4 years ago, I think it was. I don't think it was not. It might have been NotPetya. It was one of the big ransomware events. Took out the NHS for 3 weeks because they were the same exact thing happened. So
Mm-hmm.
it's not like they haven't been through this before. So this is either a commentary on they didn't learn their lessons. The bad guys are maybe getting better, but I'm going to lean into, and this is for probably the bottom two of bullets here, is people need to be doing tabletop exercises for their incident response plan. If you need to start diverting patients and transporting patients to other facilities, you need to know that. And your CMO, your chief medical officer, needs to be deeply involved in your tabletop exercise because they're going to make life changing or life saving decisions in the process. So everybody thinks it's an IT exercise or, hey, it's for the compliance folks to worry about. No, it's for the CMO to get in and roll up their sleeves and understand all the critical decisions they're going to have to make in the case of especially a crippling ransomware attack. So I look at this and I wonder, were they prepared to understand what they needed to do to maintain patient care?
And I believe Mike and John, isn't the NHS attack, didn't it come through an MSP?
It did. It was Advantage something. I can't remember the name of the MSP, but yeah, it's another case of the unlocked window being used to, you know, get to the actual victim. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, it's not just the United States. It's healthcare everywhere. Right now, there's a big hospital down in Paris. Same thing.
Mm-hmm.
$10 million extortion demand.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Go ahead, John.
Jake, I would just want to echo kind of what Fred said about practicing. So, you know, we do have to take systems down periodically for maintenance and upgrades and those kind of things. And in those cases, we all have downtime procedures. And, you know, but typically the system's only down for a short period of time. Maybe it's an hour or two. And so we can kind of muddle through that pretty easily. But when it's down for half a day or days or weeks, it becomes very, very complicated. So So I would just echo not only the practice, so you have muscle memory, but it's also helpful to make sure that you dust off your downtime procedures from time to time and make sure that they're updated and accurate, and then practice those so that if an event happens where you have to be down for more than that typical maintenance window, people know what to do.
Yeah, actually, at the American Hospital Association Rural Conference, one of the things that somebody presented about was that they did a tabletop exercise and they had an IR plan that was good for one day. And it was good. Like, we have an outage for 6 hours. Everybody knows what to do, but they did not have a great plan for, we have an outage for 3 weeks. What does that look like, John, to your point? And that was,
I don't think anybody has a good plan for a 3 week.
yeah.
That's
Yep. They hadn't even accounted for it as something that might happen, I think. So yeah, exactly. Okay. And I asked in the chat here, based on what Fred said, question for the audience: are your medical teams involved in your tabletop exercises? Eric says we've had HR and payroll managers in our tabletop as well. That's great. Make sure that you have everybody involved, because as we know, ransomware or any attack on the hospital can impact any department. Okay, so let's get to what is in the breach report. So, as folks are probably familiar with, HHS, Health and Human Services, has what is commonly known as the wall of shame. And that is, if you have a breach that impacts the records affecting more than 500 individuals, then you have to report it to HHS, and HHS puts it on their website and they say, look, here is this breach. You have to report, you can't not report. And then it stays up there for 24 months. And so that's the data that we dig into, and we look at the commonalities, and we look at the trends there, because the web page doesn't give you trends, it just gives you a list. So this is what it looks like. And I want to report some good news here. If you look at, and again, remember, we do this every 6 months. So when you look at H1 and H2, beginning of 2019, back half of 2019, beginning of 2020, back half of 2020. And obviously here, pandemic hit here. And one of the things that happened was there was a lot of breaches and people didn't report them until the second half of 2020. But look at this steady decline. Fred, I think we can say there's some good news here.
There is good news. The question is if the good news is just that the bad guys have diverted their attention to a war in Ukraine and to the political unrest and all the other things that are going on, or conversely, they're stealing sensitive, trade secrets rather than stealing intellectual or stealing records. But I think this shows another trend, and that is, once we got to the point where pretty much every hospital can look and say, either I've been hit, or I know everyone around me has been hit, and they know that their number will be up. So I believe that healthcare is finally getting behind security and starting to batten down the hatches and close at least most of those wide open doors that frankly were probably open for quite a while. So I think it's a combination of diversion of attention, and I think healthcare is getting better. I think they're starting to do the right things.
Yeah, and I mean, John, would you agree with that? Do you think, this is the sort of ransomware wake up, and then good news here?
I can certainly at least correlate that from things that I've seen within my circles. We mentioned earlier consolidation in healthcare, and so usually that's smaller folks merging with bigger folks, and in a lot of cases that then by nature improves security by moving to those systems and security postures that they have. So I think that that's what makes sense to me when we see getting better. Certainly there's more opportunity today, so we have security as a service and things where folks can start to leverage vendors and manage security services to help improve their posture relatively quickly.
Yeah, I mean, because Mike, you can't just hire against this. You can't go out and say, "Hey, I'm going to go hire 50 security professionals."
Yeah, well, I mean that's why cybersecurity as a service is a thing. But I am going to respectfully disagree here. Yes, it looks like there's signal there. The total number is going down. I would say that within the precision of the measurement, every one of those last three bars is exactly the same. Frankly, it is late reporting, and there will be more added to this. There is stuff going on in Russia, and they are preoccupied with other things. A lot of these criminals may have gotten sucked into their army. And yes, I think the health sector is getting better. Once you get hit, you get religion. But I see no reason why this isn't all going to bounce back. I think this is ultimately is going to be a temporary drop. And like I say, within the precision of the measurement, okay, because this is just who reported, how was it tallied up? Um, there's not enough variability in all of this to say that, that signal is really real.
Well, we like disagreement. That's why we have panels.
Mm.
The individual breaches reported from EMR incidents. So this is, remember that iCare one we talked about before. You can, and again, I don't mean this as a pun, but you can see here that that we are seeing for the first time individual breaches reported from EMR incidents really jumping up. We saw a few in 2020, a few in 2021. But John, the thing about this iCare one was, is that it impacted so many different organizations.
Yeah, I think the total was somewhere around 650, if I remember reading that right. But again, ultimately, lots of users of an EMR, many organizations, millions of records. So it's very impactful.
Yeah, and Fred, the more people who use an EMR, if that EMR has a breach, the more the more impactful it is.
Well, I think one of the other things is, we're seeing a consolidation of EMRs. There's a lot of, regional EMRs where multiple hospitals will participate in a singular EMR kind of implementation. So I think again, there's some consolidation component. In other words, I can go after an EMR and not just get one small rural access hospital, but I can get 7 of them that all participate in the same shared EMR infrastructure. So I think that that's part of it. And it's also there's consolidation of EMR. I mean, we've got probably 3 big players out there, in the EMR space, and 10 years ago it was a lot more distributed. So I think that's contributing as well.
Yeah, I mean, if this becomes Epic or Cerner or something, that number just absolutely jumps. And by the way, I'm
Or
not
Oracle.
and I'm not predicting that happens, and certainly not saying that it will. But I mean, this is
I'll
a
go ahead and
signal and
predict that.
something
I'm
and
fine
something.
predicting that.
Okay. So, but a question, if you have to have one of these companies, and do you John, in your seat, you don't want to go with, one of these companies that's never done it before. They're like, hey, you're our first customer. Like, I don't know that you want to do that, but at the same time, if the EMR company that you're going with has so many different hospitals, so many different organizations, it puts you at higher risk. What do you do to protect yourself, to defend yourself against a breach in a vendor like that?
Well, I certainly think that, again, my personal opinion here is that vendors have to be held more accountable. Particularly in the healthcare space, we run into a lot of vendors that hide behind the FDA and don't want to make updates to their systems, and that puts healthcare at risk. Um, and so I think that that's getting better, but I also think that we have to put pressure on our vendors to be more accountable for the way that the code is written, the way that the updates, the turnaround for updates and patches and ensuring that those happen. And again, you just have to have a rigorous third party assessment and make sure that you've asked the right questions, that you have thoroughly vetted your vendors to make sure that they're taking security seriously as well, because that puts exposure on you.
And Fred, I know you've spent a lot of time on third-party risk, and how do you, what advice do you give organizations?
Yeah, well, I mean, in healthcare, this is a critical component. And obviously, we sign business associate agreements. HIPAA kind of started this concept of we need to have our third parties accountable. So, you've got to consider your third parties, whoever you're dealing with, just like you saw with PFC. They have a breach, you report, right? So you've got to consider them kind of a part of your infrastructure, and you need to do your due diligence. And the due diligence is a lot more than just having agreements and things in your BA. You should do things like, hey, I want to request a vulnerability report before we sign on with you to address whether you're patching properly. And so you need to dig a little bit deeper with these. It shouldn't be that hard for them in this modern world to produce papers to show that have a robust program. So I think it's a matter of deep due diligence, and then you have to monitor these people after the fact, right? Once you've done it, doesn't mean they're going to continue to do that. So you need to stay on top of them, have some sort of a check-in or touch point where you can validate that their security has not changed.
Yeah, and I'll add here, without going too deep into it. So the iCare EMR, there and you can Google it and you can see there's been a lot of frustration with them. The breach happened a while ago. Some doctors say that they were stonewalled, that they didn't know that it happened, that they're not getting the information they need so they can be forthright with the patients. Some organizations are pretty unhappy with the way they've dealt with it. It is one of those situations, Mike, as the CISO for this company, for Critical Insight, you have a pretty rigorous system that you put people through if they want to do business with us.
Yeah, that's why I think I have a good suggestion as to what to do here. So if you are signing business associate agreements, you have a lot of leverage. And in today's world, insurance companies are saying, you must monitor your network. Okay. No monitoring, no insurance. So it stands to reason that, yes, you can put them through a ringer when you do your procurement and you say, show me your SOC 2 report or your high trust certification or whatever. But they're doing monitoring. Okay. They're monitoring their network. It is not unconscionable to ask your vendors to provide incident reports and monitoring data on a regular cadence to their customers, right? This is the same thing. There are insurance companies today that will give you better premiums if you wear a Fitbit, because they understand exactly what kind of risk you are, how much exercise you get, how much sleep you get, blah blah blah, right? Insurance companies, in fact, and we work with one of these, are starting to inch towards, we want to monitor you 24/7 so that we understand your risk. A hospital doesn't need to monitor their vendor 24/7, but if that vendor's monitoring themselves, give me a report once a month. Show me what happened on your network. How many things did you turn away? How many, what was hitting your firewall? Is there increased interest in you? That would be easy to require of vendors.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'll get on a soapbox here for a second and say stop requiring these ridiculous 300 questionnaires.
Yeah,
and
those are
actually
nuts.
and actually look at like what lowers risk, because it's
And
not
nobody's
going.
looking at the answers to those things. They're ticking off a box.
And we're going to get to insurance in a minute. So let me go through a couple other things, and then we're going to talk about insurance. So total breaches by segment here. So you can see, health plans continue to be flat, business associate breaches up, and healthcare provider breaches down a little bit. The important thing here on the right, though, are these bullet points. Specialty clinics now are the top source of data breaches, and they're up significantly from a year ago. Um, Fred, why specialty clinics?
Because they haven't put the time and effort into securing their infrastructure. They, to some degree, they sit kind of aside of what the standard hospital kind of infrastructure that we think about. So they've they adhere to slightly different practices and different approaches because they tend to have very specific technologies and treatments that they use. So they're just not spending the time on it. They don't have they're not large enough in the sense usually where people look and go, hey, they should have a really robust program here. They tend to have kind of a check the box program. So that's where I would lean in on the specialty clinics.
And going back to that, maybe good news, unless you ask Mike Hamilton, hospital systems now dropping to number 2, John, that may be because, they've done better with security.
Yeah. Again, and I forget who said it, but certainly, security has the interest of the board, and rightfully so. And so boards are actively requesting report outs, and wanting to know more information about the security posture of the organization, and then certainly directing dollars to make sure that that's being taken care of. I used to work for an organization where I was the CISO many years ago, and the only request from the CEO was, John, just keep me out of the news. And so, there is, I think, more dollars being spent, and more attention being given to the security posture of the organizations.
Jake, I want to point out the most boring piece of information here might actually be the most interesting, and that is health plans. The fact that they're flat year over year, basically forever at this point, tells me that the health insurance industry has figured out how to secure their infrastructure, and they have accepted some level of breach. You can see the numbers there: 1.3 million records, 39 a year. If that's a continuous number that doesn't change, then they have found some level of security that their risk management says is okay. I think they're telling us something here. If they're holding flat, we should all be looking into what they're doing and meeting that same level of security, and then we'll be holding healthcare breaches flat probably as well.
Are they regulated by the finance sector as well?
Probably, but I can't remember. It's mostly HIPAA.
Yeah, there's got to be some GLBA in there or something.
Yeah, if they're given credit, there's definitely GLBA in there.
I do want to call out a couple of things in the chat here where, Eric says, I think a lot of these smaller clinics have the mentality of, I'm not large enough to be on the attacker's radar.
He's not wrong. Yeah.
And then Nathan says, that's something we struggle with at a critical access hospital. Mike, you actually recently did another presentation about nobody's off the radar, right?
Yeah, nobody's off the radar. It's, these criminals, this is a corporation we're dealing with here. Okay. So what they're doing is they're going down market, and they're going sideways to these third-party providers, right? The unlocked window. And that's very intentional, because for them, from the perspective of the criminal organization, what they are getting is efficiency, they're getting risk reduction, and they're optimizing their revenue. All right. So, I mean, viewed from a business perspective, through the lens of these attackers, that's what they're doing. And it makes all the sense in the world. I think Fred's got a good point about, and I do think it has something to do with an intersection with the finance sector, why health plans maybe look better here. The business associate thing is just going to continue to go up. They're going down market, and for sometimes it's to get, you have a big pot of records for all of these organizations, and sometimes it's, you're my jumping off spot to get to the victim I want to get to. So that's just going to continue, and it's because the corporation that we're dealing with knows how to optimize its activities.
Yeah, and I think too, it might not be a mentality of, I'm not large enough, but I've had responsibility for a critical access hospital in my system in Oklahoma, And, my IT guy also was the accountant and was also CLEAT certified and did physical security and, carried a taser. So, folks are wearing multiple hats and have lots of responsibility, and it's very difficult to take the time to practice these things on a regular basis, and that's certainly not intentional. It's just everyone's busy and has a lot on their plate, and that's true for really anybody these days. We're all short staffed, we're all busy, and taking time out of the day to review this stuff and to practice it's very difficult.
Yeah, and to that end, John, and by the way, knowing that the head of IT is carrying a taser, I can only imagine. You don't turn
Yep.
on your
That's a
two
cool
F.
factoid.
I know you don't turn on your 2FA, and you might get zapped as a really, I think a different kind of threat than what I've heard before. Eric, who's in the chat, I hope he's taking notes. Then Eric just types, "You will remember your password."
That's right.
But I mean, I think that financial pressure on hospitals has not gotten better, and right now is in a really tough place, right, John?
So say it again, Jake. I'm sorry.
I said you were thinking about tasering people who can't.
I was. I'm
passwords.
sorry. I was.
I think that's a good place for your mind to go. No, I said right now, when we talk about being short-staffed, that right now we are in this somewhat unique period where people are leaving their jobs. There's violence against hospital workers. There's things going on in nursing. The staffing and financial pressures right now on hospitals don't make this any easier on all healthcare organizations. Can you talk a little bit about what's going on with the financial pressures you're seeing everywhere?
Yeah, what I'm seeing and true for our organization as well is that that one of the largest costs these days are contract resources. And certainly during the pandemic, we saw contract resources go up around nursing and those kind of things. But now what I'm seeing is from an IT perspective. I mean, we're really struggling to keep people staffed. When you add in the pressure of, we had folks working from home, and now we're asking them to come back into the office, and so folks are leaving, looking for opportunities to stay remote and to work remotely. It's really been a challenge. We have several large projects going on where we've had to staff them with contract resources, and so across the board, our biggest expense is contract resources, not just IT, but across the board. So that's eating away at our ability to spend money on other things. And then when you couple that with supply chain pressures and then inflation, you've got you've just got some extreme financial pressures that you have to deal with, and it is very difficult.
And Fred, knowing that those financial pressures exist and show no sign of abating, how do you talk? I'm looking through the audience here, and I'm seeing a lot of IT directors, a lot of folks who, Andy, who is the IT director and security officer, on site. And I've asked him if he's ever tasered anyone forgetting their password. We'll find out in a minute. But how do you talk? How should those folks be talking to with these financial pressures? How do they talk to their CEOs, CFOs, boards about, hey, we have to continue to get better at cybersecurity?
Yeah, I mean, you have to lean into the patient care argument. I think the breach and loss of records thing, upper management cares, legal cares, compliance cares. The bulk of the hospital are caregivers, right? And I don't know, how much they care, but they certainly care about ability, continuity of care, about potential, injury to a patient or worse. I think if you lean into these concepts, which are going to be outcomes, these are absolutely going to be outcomes. We saw it with the first slide with the baby in Louisiana. Lean into this because this is what people care about. And this is the whole, I mean, yeah, we did it for privacy reasons originally, but I think most people now look at it and go, if that hospital can no longer operate, people will die. So you really, really need to lean into what is the worst thing is not losing 1,000 or 10,000 records. The worst thing is a patient can't get the care they need. So lean heavily into that concept, and absolutely any of these risks that we're talking about are risks to patient care. Every one of them that we're talking about, Rob, probably is a risk to patient care. So that's what I would focus on, because that's really what matters.
And that's one thing to point out. We haven't hit the third bullet point here, which is services and supplies. So pharmacies, medical supply companies, provider alliances, and thanks to Brett, who dug into the data to figure it out. So when you look at the data, it doesn't necessarily say what those are, but those are the services and supplies that had breaches, and those are up 4%. I think, John, that goes back to what you were saying about those third parties, those, the people doing services for you, are a real threat vector.
Yeah, and everything, as we know, is so interconnected these days. And so you mentioned network drives. We love to download data into Excel spreadsheets and then store them on the network forever. And so, that just becomes a huge source. Knowing where your data is and where it's going is half the battle. So investing some time, that's part of that third party risk assessment, is how do we transmit data?
Mm-hmm.
Is it securely transmitted? Are we dumping it on a file share and letting people come in and get it, or are we just sending it via an email message over to the vendor? So those are all things that if you take the time up front and you put those measures in place, it can help reduce that risk.
Yeah, and a real provocative question in the chat here. If the cybersecurity cost becomes unbearable, is that the time to return to paper records? And Mike, I don't know that the cybersecurity cost is unbearable. I think it's unbearable if you have to hire all the people in house.
Well, so yes, I mean, but when we're talking about thin margins and we're talking about, working especially in a rural district or something like that, we're at the point here where the government's really got to step up and start busting out the checkbook with some grants or something to bring up the level of security in these organizations, right? There's always been this discussion about, should security be a function of regulation or market forces, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And I would posit that market forces aren't going to work if your healthcare is scarcely available. You're not going to go, they don't have good security, so I'm going to go to the hospital. It's 500 miles away. You're not going to do that. So that whole, regulation versus market forces thing won't work. Okay. Security is not going to be a competitive differentiator for a hospital. On the other hand, there's this difference between the public harm done by all of this stuff versus the private responsibility to make it all not happen. Okay. That's a disconnect. And the only way to fix that is for the government to do what it's doing for state and local government right now, which is bust out the checkbook. We don't want water purification falling over. Well, we don't want hospitals falling over either. So let's get with the program.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Hey, so let's go back to the insurance question, because that's come up a couple of different times. So, for folks who don't know, I bet everybody does, but cyber insurance has become harder to get and harder to retain. What's happened is that the insurance companies who never thought that they would pay out $4 million now get we have one case in, I forget where, I think Oregon, forget where they got hit by ransomware. The bad guys said, all right, your ransom is $4 million. They said, we can't pay $4 million. We don't have $4 million. And sure enough, the bad guys said, well, the first thing we did is we lifted your insurance papers and your policy is for $4 million. Right. And so, yeah, the bad guys know, and it has impacted insurance. And so, so a couple of questions for you guys. Do you think that the insurance controls have made hospitals get better security? Like, is that the thing that's made the board do it? And second is, what do you see as the future relationship there as it becomes harder to keep insurance? Fred, start with you.
No. So this is a tough one, because having been involved with the HIPAA regulation since its inception in the mid 90s, that was supposed to be the catalyst for people to start making these changes. Now, the big stick now is insurance, right? If I can't get insurance, then I can't transfer my risk. Greatly, greatly increases the risk to the entity. So yeah, it's a market force that's actually forcing people to do the right thing. Is it going to make them do all the right things? Well, if unless it says you should have multi-factor authentication everywhere, not multi-factor authentication, because then they put it on the VPN outside and that's it. Not good enough. You need to say you need to monitor 24/7, 365. Absolutely, that should be done. You should be doing annual risk assessments. You should be doing penetration tests. You should be doing quarterly vulnerability assessment. Until the basic blocking and tackling, and having an IR plan, right? Until all those basic blocking and tackling things are part of insurance, and they actually do something rather than saying, "Do you have it?" Yes. Well, that should be more like, and show it to me and let me see if it's good
Yeah.
enough, right?
Yeah.
So that's the
Yeah.
problem.
Yeah, and Mike, you've spent a lot of time on insurance, and we're talking about the new Lloyd's of
yeah.
London thing. What do you want to mention that? Eric brings it up in the chat here,
Yeah, that's
and
a
talk
big
about your
deal.
thoughts on insurance.
Sure. So the Lloyd's of London thing, and as Lloyd's goes, so goes the rest of the industry. And what they're saying is, if we can implicate a state actor at all in any of these, we're not going to cover them. It's an act of war. And there's a certain logic there. That attribution is more difficult than I think Lloyd's is thinking about. But, there are ways where our defense intelligence people can identify individuals. So we know it can be done. But to answer your question, yes, I think insurance, let's call it regulation, because that's essentially what it is, right? Insurance companies have become kind of the de facto regulators for everybody. I think it's making things better, but that's more for the third parties that were never regulated before, other than hospitals, which have always been regulated. Right. So, it's new for, your urinal cake vendor to have requirements from the insurance industry. They never had that before. So they're going to put something together so they can get insurance, because in their BAA, they're going to be required to have that. So I think that is making things better. Now, second part of your question is, how is the relationship going to change? I think it's going to be required reporting on monitoring. I think the only way for insurance companies to actually understand what their risk is, the risk that is represented by an insured, is some kind of continuous monitoring. Right? They don't have 200-year-old actuarial tables, say what's the likelihood of this thing happening. So they're going to have to, do what, right now, when you drive your car is always reporting how fast you drive back somewhere, and your insurance rates are calculated based on that. That is going to land here.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I'll bring up here a chart of the services that we have to talk about that, because we've just talked to an insurance company that is working with us and a couple of our customers to say, hey, to lower your risk, you actually need 24/7 threat detection and investigation, the SOC as a service. You actually need an IR plan that you test with a tabletop exercise, and you need to be able to rapidly quarantine assets, that are infected, and you need an annual risk assessment. Now, one of the nice things about the risk assessment, of course, is hospitals do those every year through a HIPAA risk assessment. And what this insurance company is saying is, if you can prove to us that you do those four things, you can skip the questionnaire and we'll figure out your cyber insurance. I'll also, and so that by the way, that is happening in the background, and I think is really cool. And if anyone wants to talk about that, shoot me an email and I'm happy to tell you more about that. The, when we look at our services and we look at things that, we've talked about here, Fred, incident preparedness, doing that, prepare for an attack, detect an attack, respond to an attack. Very, very important.
Yeah, as I said, everybody will be hit. Everybody, everybody. And if you're not ready to respond, you're not going to minimize the impact part of the risk equation. So the risk equation, if you've forgotten, is somebody taking advantage of a vulnerability. What's the probability of that times the impact? And all our preventative controls are all about that first factor, preventing somebody from taking advantage. If you're not managing the second factor, the impact factor, which is quick monitoring, a well-developed incident response plan, a team that is trained with all the tools they need to go out and mitigate the risk as fast as possible. I mean, I try to liken it to, like, if you watch like an IndyCar or NASCAR pit crew, that's how your IR team needs to operate at light speed, fully coordinated. It's muscle memory at that point. Everything they know and they're doing is something that's already known. It's not something you have to figure out on the fly. So that's such a key component of this. I can't lean into that enough.
So two things here as we get toward the end of our time here, and we'll do final thoughts. If anybody wants to talk to us, we have a woman on our team, Ellie. She can set you up with anyone here if you want to talk to them, Mike or Fred or John, or if you want to talk about insurance, hit me up. And then our 800 number there, you can call 24/7 and get us. I do want to do some final thoughts here, John. We looked at the report, we looked at some news headlines. Final thoughts here.
Yeah, I mean, certainly there's some encouragement I think you can take from the numbers, but I think we would all agree that the numbers are still way too high, right? Really, still something that we need to maintain a focus on and maintain diligence around. So I will be curious. There certainly is. When you look at the anatomy of a cyber attack, there certainly is a delay in uncovering, right? Sometimes these can lay dormant in our networks for a while before they're actually uncovered, and then there's a delay in reporting. So it will be interesting to see if we continue to see a downward trend, or if we start to see that trickle back up. And based off the headlines we reviewed, and things that aren't in the numbers, my expectation would be that we're going to maintain the current levels or see it rise next half.
And we're going to do final thoughts from Mike next, and then Fred. I do want to tell folks we do appreciate when you come. We put a survey in the chat. We love when folks take the survey, give us your comments, helps us both as a company design our services better, and gives us feedback on these presentations. So, they get better every time. Although if you've been to one of these before and it didn't get better this time, you can tell us that too. All right, Mike, final thoughts.
Final thoughts. So, I think the health sector is looking better in terms of its ability to fend these things off, at least from the numbers that we're looking at right here. It might be temporary. It might be a function of reporting and what's going on in Ukraine and Russia and other things like that. It could bounce all the way back. But the character of who's getting attacked is definitely changing. I think it's it's a business decision made by criminal corporations. And frankly, I'll double down on this. Government needs to get into the fight. They need to bust out the checkbook and start really focusing on especially rural health.
Yep. Fred, final thoughts.
Yeah. So I'm paid to be a pessimist. I believe it's going to bounce back hard because the Russians are running out of money. Okay. They can't finance the war any longer. This will have to turn, in my opinion, to major financial gain for the Russian hacking crews. So I'm of the mind that you need to toughen your defenses and look less like a target than your neighbor, because they're going to be coming like the horde when things get a little bit worse.
Don't have to run faster than the bear.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Please take the survey. We appreciate you joining. If you want to get in touch, email us. Email Ellie at criticalinsight.com. Should get you in touch with anybody here. Folks are interested in that insurance thing that I brought up. I'm working on that, so let me know. I know those surveys are a big pain in the blankety blank. And thanks so much for joining us. Hope your summer is going well, and we'll see you again at the end of the year when we do the whole year breach report. So thanks everybody, and have an awesome day. Bye-bye.
Thanks for coming.